we talk about the factors which characterize an optimum feeding system. After feed availability, number 2 in my mind is our stalls, resting area. You don't usually think of resting area as being part of the feed system, but it's as important as the feed itself, right? Because of that relationship between eating and resting and ruminating time.
Welcome to the Rumination Podcast presented by Jeffo Nutrition. Hi, I'm your host, Chris Gwyn, and today I am really pleased to receive Dr. Rick Grant to discuss on the topic of stocking density and the impact on how cows respond to their diets that have been formulated, mixed, and delivered in order to maximize milk component yield. Dr. Grant, as many of our listeners will know, received his BSc degree in animal science with a dairy science emphasis from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Further, he received a PhD in animal science, again, ruminant nutrition from Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. And subsequent to that, Dr. Grant was a postdoctoral scientist at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center in Madison, Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin in Madison, working with Dr. Dave Mertens, in particular on measuring and modeling rumen forage degradation and passage. From 1990 to 2003, Dr. Grant was a professor and extension dairy specialist in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Lincoln, Nebraska. Since 2003, until his recent retirement, Dr. Grant was president of the William H. Miner Agriculture Research Institute in Chazy, New York, which, of course, many of us know and regard as a nonprofit educational and research institution focused on dairy cattle, forage, equine, and nutrient management. Rick, of course, is well known to the global dairy industry for his extension and research in the areas of ruminant carbohydrate nutrition, in particular, looking at fiber, forage particle size, and all those interactions, in also measuring forage quality and applied dairy cattle behavior and management, which is a topic we'll dig a bit more deeper in today. So, Dr. Grant, with that in mind, I want to welcome you to the Rumination Podcast.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I always feel a little bit embarrassed listening to all that, but it's a pleasure to be here today. I look forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. And don't be embarrassed. It's a lifetime of work that you've done and highly regarded, and so it should be mentioned.
Makes me feel old.
Well, it's anyway. Experience, Dr. Grant. Experience.
There you go.
So on this topic, Dr. Grant, I want to dig down a little deeper. Many regions of the world, and perhaps in my experience, particularly in the USA, the dairy industry managed to a higher than 100% stocking density. And I'm wondering if you could expand in your research and in your experience and scientific knowledge, what is the important for producers and nutritionists to consider when they're optimizing stock and density on their dairies?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the world doesn't exist, I don't think, where we can just say you don't overcrowd, right? One stall, one cow, one headlock, one cow. That doesn't exist, at least in the U.S. dairy industry. So you have the question you just asked. What separates the herds that can successfully manage for some level of overcrowding and those that cannot? And there's at least 2 or 3 main factors that we can get into today, Chris. One would be I had an aha moment a few years ago when myself and a grad student realized that, we need to think about overcrowding as a subclinical stressor. And that allows us to think about how the same level of stocking density, say of stalls or feed bunk, it doesn't affect every herd the same, because the point at which a subclinical stressor affects a cow within a herd really is a function of the quality of the management on that dairy as well as the quality of the facilities. And that helps us explain the large variation we see. For instance, in how cows respond to us, let's say 130%. We know some herds where they seemingly are doing okay, but there's some where that's a train wreck, right? So subclinical stressor is a big one. The other thing I would say, and then I'll pause for a minute, is just we know this, but we don't think about it enough. When we say stocking density, we count stalls, we count cows, or we count headlocks, we count cows. But we need to always step back and think within a pen, what is the experienced stocking density from an individual cow's perspective, if you get what I'm saying there? I think that's something we need to think more about in terms of managing a given stocking density on a specific farm, the cow's perspective.
Okay, so you're going to have to dig down a little deeper at the experience of that cow. So can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, what I mean by that, and again, some of this we've known for a long time, some of it's pretty new information, but let's say you have 125% stocking density. Well, I would argue, and I think the research would say, and certainly on-farm observations would tell us, that not every cow in that pen of cows is going to be experiencing 125%, for instance. So, right, subordinate cows is a classic example. First calf heifers in a commingled pen of older cows, we know about that. They are going to experience something higher. Lame cows, how many herds have, let's say, moderately lame cows in the pen, right? They're not lame enough for the producer to decide to pull them out, but they're out there competing, and our research is pretty clear. They are at a decided disadvantage, right? They're experiencing a stocking density higher than the calculated one. And the most recent information, Chris, is we just looked at this about a year or so ago in our own herd. Cows do not use all of the facilities in a pen the same, uniformly, whether it's stalls, water, feed bunk, particularly stalls. We did a study where we found that cows tend to prefer the stalls, all other things being equal. They prefer the stalls nearest the pen exit, particularly lame cows. And doesn't that make sense? If you're a lame cow and walking is a bit challenging for you, you may have 50 stalls to choose from, but you choose the ones that are closest to the exit or to the entrance, right? And so that tells me right there that a simple mathematical calculation of stocking density would fail those moderately lame cows, right? Because they don't have 50 stalls available to them, for argument's sake. They might only have 10 or 12 if you allow them to express their natural desired resting behavior. Hopefully that makes sense. That's something we need to wrestle with in the industry.
No, it does make sense. And thank you for sharing that, because again, we do see differences farm to farm, cow to cow, how they manage that. So thinking of how we measure that on the farm, a question could come to mind, but what are some of the key metrics or cow observations that we should follow in order to ensure that stocking density is in fact what we use on the farm as far as stocking density helps us to maximize that component yield or profitability on the farm?
Yeah, so what do we measure? Well, certainly the things that we normally measure, like milk yield, intake, repro, health, all of those things can give us clues in terms of how well the cows in that pen are dealing with the day-over-day chronic subclinical stress of the overcrowding. Because one thing I really didn't get into is when you have a subclinical stressor like overcrowding, it may not result in a measurable impact on the cow, right? If the herd management is good, facilities are good, there's heat abatement, there's all of that. But at some point, every herd will have a problem with additional stressors. And how many stressors are there on a typical farm? The list is long. You might say time outside the pen too long. Are all the stalls comfortable? You know, is feed available 24/7? All these things are critical factors which can snowball or add to the negative consequences of some subclinical degree of overcrowding, right? So I guess the point is things like milk production, repro health, they may not be changing very measurably in terms of a given farm if they have great facilities and good management, right? But you look at behavior, particularly resting. That's sort of like the canary in the mine shaft. That's that analogy doesn't make sense with cows, but you know what I'm saying. Resting is if overcrowding and the other combined stressful factors on that farm, if they combine to see a measurable impact in resting, and hopefully in the future more herds can measure that is the surest thing I know of. Reduced resting, and then what goes along with that, Chris, would be reduced rumination while resting or lying down. And that I've come to think is one of the most critical behaviors that the cow has to remain healthy and productive. How much rumination is occurring while she's lying down?
Yeah. That's thank you for that. It's always useful to try and get that to the minimum of what can we measure to understand the impact. So thank you. And that you talked about earlier about how perhaps different farms can cope with different levels of on-farm overcrowding or stocking density. And so in your experience and what you've studied, what do you feel are some of the key management nutritional differences that those farms adopt to impact how they manage through that? In short, what are the essential factors in managing these cow pens if we're managing to a higher level of stocking density?
Yeah. Well, we did some work a number of years ago. We looked at almost 80 farms in New York and Vermont, and it was all breeds. So I say all Jersey and Holstein breeds, tie stalls, free stalls, some robotic herds. And the things that rose to the top in terms of essential factors that they have to have a good handle on, that sort of differentiates the herds that are doing a good job of managing, say, some modest overcrowding, and those that aren't, those herds that have good components and those which have only average or below average components. Well, first of all, they don't go as high in bunk stocking density. So they just don't push the system as hard. That's simple to say, but that was the biggest factor. In fact, when we looked at all the variation in terms of milk, fat, and protein across these 79 herds, 65% of the variation in component output was due just to bunk stocking density, not necessarily nutrition. I mean, fat level, physically effective fiber, all those are important as we would expect. But the biggest single factor is bunk stocking density. And then on top of that were things like feeding frequency, feed push-ups. In other words, getting to the fact, is feed available 24/7? And again, there's nothing really cutting edge about this. There's not rocket science, but it's the basics. And sometimes I feel like a broken record because we keep saying you've got to have feed in front of the cow, right? And we've been saying that for a long time. But guess what? Every time you ask the cows in a study like we did with these 79 farms, they tell you resoundingly, keep feed in front of us and make sure we're not overcrowded so we don't have to deal with excessive competition and change our feeding behavior, our resting behavior, right? And then we also need to make sure we have comfortable beds, 4 inches deep bedded stalls. And sometimes farmers laugh, but it's true. If you talk about the factors which characterize an optimum feeding system, after feed availability, number 2 in my mind is our stalls, resting area. You don't usually think of resting area as being part of the feed system, but it's as important as the feed itself, right? Because of that relationship between eating and resting and ruminating time. You can't have half of it right and not worry about the other half, which would be lying down ruminating, because that gives them better rumen pH, better intake, better milk components.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you for those. So as we often like to do in these podcasts, and you've kind of done it perhaps in the last, but just to bring home that take-home message, given that all that you've seen and all that you've studied, these 4 key takeaways that you would share with the audience, nutritionists, veterinarians, and of course, primary producers, if they're going to manage through stocking density, what do they need to really pay attention to?
Yeah. Well, I think the best answer for that hit me a couple of years ago, I was reading this paper on, of all things, robotic milking systems, automated milking systems. And it was over 120 farms. It was done by Trevor DeVries' group in Quebec, Ontario, leader in that area. And what struck me is the factors on the farm that contributed to the best milk yield, the best lameness outcomes, were the exact same list of factors that we've seen with freestall barns, and probably even tie stall barns to a certain extent, but it's feed push-ups and deep bedded sand. In these 120 farms, those 2 factors, feed availability, comfortable stalls, deep bedded sand, resulted in 4 to 5 pounds at least more milk production on average. Okay. The other thing, think about lameness, right? The big factors there in these robot herds, it's the same as the freestall herds: greater bunk space, feeding frequency, deep bedded stalls. You sound like a broken record, but those factors rise to the top in every study that I'm aware of. So if someone's thinking I've got limited cash to expend on my farm, you've got to start with some of these big factors before you start nibbling around the edge on some of the smaller factors, right? That's my thought. And at the end of the day, if you can get that done, you're going to have a good balance in your herd between eating time, eating behavior, and you're going to have that recumbent rumination, that lying down rumination that we think is so critical to cow health and performance.
No, very sage advice and summary. So thank you, Dr. Grant. It's been a real pleasure to meet with you and discuss with you on this topic. And thank you so much for sharing this important information and your life experience and research experience and on-farm experience with the audience about the positive effects of what we can do related to cows, related to how we manage through higher stocking densities and the key aspects that need to be done. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
And I also want to thank the audience for listening to us and remind you that you can subscribe to our channel at jeffo.ca so that you don't miss our next episode of Jeffo's Rumination Podcast. Please find us at jeffo.ca, Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jeffo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. Have a great day.